Good evening and welcome all. Let us start today's program with Shantimand. I urge everyone to repeat Shantimand after us. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah.
Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah.
Sarve Santu Niramaya.
Sarve Santo Niramaya.
Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu.
Bhadrani Pashyantu.
Ma Kaschid Dukbhag Bhavet.
Kashya Dukbha Bhave.
Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Let new India arise out of the peasant's cottage, grasping the plough, out of the huts of the fisherman, the cobbler and the sweeper. Let us spring from the grocer's shop, from besides the oven of the fritter seller. Let her emanate from the factory, from marts and from markets. Let her emerge from groves and forests, from hills and mountains. These were the great words of Swami Vivekananda, which have stirred a passion in the thousands of Indian hearts to arise, awake and engineer the India envisioned by Swamiji, the India of our dreams.
Namaste, I Rahul Jain and my friend Vishweet Agarwal is really happy to invite you all to this evening to the talk by Mr. Shobhit Mathur and Mr. J. Sai Deepak. VSC stands for Vivekananda Study Circle. VSC is a group of enthusiasts who are inspired by the thoughts of Vivekananda. The regularly organized talks of eminent speakers who are working in the direction of Swamiji's vision to make a new India. The motive of such talks is to enhance the dimension of life sought by Swami Vivekananda.
Here we would like to introduce to AINA and its activities. AINA is an abbreviation for an initiative for national advancement. AINA also stands for mirror, a mirror to see the real self, the unqualified self about the body, mind and ego. AINA was founded 10 years back in 2010 by a group of seniors at IIT Delhi who went on a journey of self-discovery. AINA is inspired by thoughts of Swami Vivekananda. We as a parivar, as a family, started a series of activities one by one. With the help and mentorship of our professors, Professor Parag Singla and Professor Numesh Bolia, we started off with the teaching program Srijan at Munirka Basti and kept on adding more, keeping track of our abilities and perceived needs. Thus we now have weekly discussions, various talks, rural immersion trips and much more.
We will tell briefly about the three major activities of AINA. The first is Srijan. The future of every nation is shaped by the young generation, so there is a strong need to prepare the children for the same. With this aim, every Tuesday, a group of enthusiastic volunteers go to Muneka to teach. In addition, to ensure their overall development and to establish a strong bonding with their children and their families, we conduct various events like talent hunt, cleanliness drive, and celebrate festivals like Holi, Diwali, Raksha Bandhan with them.
A lot of us are interested to discuss and think about a variety of topics around and above our acads, with the motive of building thought process and enhancing individuals' perspective. Every Friday, a discussion is held, where we sit and discuss on variety topics, ranging from topics of national interest, to topics of importance of art and culture, to the aspirations and responsibilities of us as IITians, and to contemporary issues in society, like that of politics, education, and equality.
Our third activity is Swadesh. India is a nation of enormous diversity where culture changes every 100 miles. At the end of every semester, we travel to different parts of the country and experience this unity in diversity. Each trip enables us to understand experiences, culture, immerse and fall in love with our country. It is true that India can't be understood while sitting in Delhi. Swadesh gives us an opportunity to connect with the 1.2 billion people, Indians, and work for their development. Some of the previous Swadesh trips are Jhabua MP, Goa, Mysore, Alwar Rajasthan and Palghar Maharashtra.
Finally, to hold the weight of our diligent audience, I would like to call upon the speakers of the today's program, Mr. J. Sai Deepak ji and Mr. Shobhit Mathur, to have their seats on the stage. Please welcome our speakers with a huge round of applause. Mr. Shobhit Mathur is a CS graduate from IIT Bombay, did his MS from the University of Washington and worked in corporate for 3 years. The zeal to work for the nation could not settle him and brought him to establish Youth for Seva in 2010 in Hyderabad, which set up a platform for the people in corporate to serve for the society. That played a pioneering role in the founding of Vision India Foundation. Being the founding members of Vision India Foundation, he has been involved in various ground level projects as well as macro level policy making projects. Most recently, he and his team has founded the Rashtam School of Public Leadership, an institute to create future leaders of India and produce research in important public issues and execute projects for a social impact.
Mr. J. Sai Deepak is an engineer turned litigator. After graduating in mechanical engineering, he went on to pursue LLB in IIT Kharagpur. Presently, an independent practitioner for before Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court, he has carved a niche for himself in the areas of civil commercial litigation, intellectual property, and the constitutional laws. He has been associated with several landmark judgments of the Supreme Court. Mr. J. Sai Deepak is an avid writer and has articles to his credit in reputed internationals, journals such as Max Planck Institute. He frequently appears in panel discussions on the Constitution. Recently, he along with his several eminent fellows has set up Indic Collective Trust, stand for Indic civilizational values through legal interventions.
We are delighted to assure ourselves that with the efforts of people like Mr. Shobhit Mathur and Mr. J. Sai Deepak, we are all set up for an Indic renaissance to make the India of our dreams and envisioned by Swami Vivekananda. The talk of today will be as a question-answer session. I would like to call our INA seniors, Divyanshu Bhaiya and Adarsh Bhaiya, to have their seats on the stage. Divyanshu Saxena is a 4th year computer science student here and Adarsh Kumar, a 4th year civil engineering student, who will be guiding the today's evening through the questions that we have received on the form that we shared. Also note that the form will be active during the entire duration of talk, and you may put your live questions on the form from the link that is provided on the screen. I would finally hand over the mics to the stage, ending with a small poem. May the insightful talk of today sprout within us the seed of Anvikshiki, the Holy Spirit of inquiry. May all thy questions get answered, and new questions may also arise within. May the blazing flame of the soul beneath eliminates all the darkness which is transient. May we emerge the spirit of the ancient mother for the renaissance of the eternal Bharat. Thank you.
We extend warm greetings to our speakers here, and we welcome you to IIT Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure for us to host you here. We hope that this event turns out to be really insightful for all of us. Also, a gentle reminder to our audience to please put their phones on the silent mode so that there is no distraction in the course of the event. Now, I think we can begin.
So, without wasting any further time, let us directly take up our first question. And many of our students got confused when we thought of having you here as our speakers. The first question was, why you changed your profession? You weren't happy as an engineer? Both of you.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Was I not happy as an engineer? Okay, so I want to give a bit of a background. This is, you choose, I entered IIT in 2000, right? That is at IIT Bombay. That's 20 years ago. And at that time, typically in high school, if you are good in maths, you are an engineer. If not, you go to medicine. That was the thing, right? So that I think still it is true for most part of the country that engineering gives you better career options, so you should go there. So you end up as an engineer and your JEE rank decides the branch you get into, right? And computer science was the branch I got into. And okay, both of us have an Andhra connect in that sense. So if you get into engineering and if you don't end up in the US, there's something wrong with you, okay? So this is like given, there's some deficiency in you if you cannot make it to the Holy Land of the US. So I ended up in the US, one of the only guys in the whole batch to not sit for placements, because at that time there were no foreign placements happening, right? You at best would get placed in very rare that you had a chance to go abroad. So I had just chose to do my masters in the US and got into Amazon. Okay, not that, and both computer science, right? BTech and masters. Amazon was in a very exciting space. What should I say? It is. I joined Amazon in 2006. People didn't know if the company would survive. It was making losses for 10 straight years by that time. It is a startup, right? It's totally a startup, not what you see today. And so the work was very, very exciting. I really enjoyed what I was doing there. Late nights, Professor Parag Singla sitting here was my roommate. And then you would see my pager going off in the middle of the night and I'm bringing the website up. And so very exciting work in that sense. But after you go through all this journey, just because what society sets the benchmark for you, right? Always, right? It is JE, then you do whatever, computer science, then you go abroad, then you get into a big company like Amazon. So you would think you are successful. That is what it would mean, right? That you did whatever society puts up as the highest benchmark for you, you achieved it. Is that it? When you get there, if you are conscious, you would think, is this the pinnacle of my life? This is what society wanted me to achieve. When you get there, probably it is not. And that is where some kind of introspection happens. Throughout this journey, never explored other parts of my personality where I could do other things, was never that. During that time, started thinking of doing other things and got into many things. That is how I realized probably I will be better off doing something else and not just engineering and what I was doing at Amazon. So that is what it is. It's basically the switch is between what society imposes on you, where you compulsively take decisions to just, because you don't have a discretion of your own, but you reach a stage in life where you get that discretion and then you are free to think what you want to do. And that's where you can explore and do other things. And for me, it turned out to be something else. It need not be the same for everybody. For me, it turned out not to be an IT or a computer engineer and do something else in life. Yeah. Sorry.
It was interesting. I was just walking down the ramp. I could be wrong, but I heard two people say, hit him, hit him. So that was interesting. I'm happy that I bring out that kind of passion. At least I bring out some interest in taking part in action as opposed to being armchair critics. Good. So as far as I'm concerned, a good number of people end up saying that, in fact, there's a running bet, whether I'm from Andhra or Tamil Nadu or Kerala, I don't know what is going on. I'm a Tamilian from Hyderabad for all practical purposes, who loves Telugu more than he loves Tamil, and who understands the script, and who can read and write in Telugu, and certainly cannot read and write in Tamil. That's a fact. Okay, there I've said it. Whoever is actually running this bet, I think I deserve at least 20% of the cut. Okay. Now coming to the question of why did I take up law? In fact, I should answer the question of why did I take up engineering in the first place? So I think that was more, I don't think there was a question of any family pressure or anything. But if you come from a low middle class family, there are very few options on the table, and the first thing that you're looking at is the return on investment the moment you take up a certain profession. Beyond that, you're not looking at anything else. So that was the first thing that was actually driving my career choices at that stage, and not that there was any family pressure to go in a certain direction, but the exposure was not too much, and therefore the conventional options and the go-to options were either engineering, medicine, and if you fail to do that, then take up chartered accountancy. If you don't get that, then you end up taking journalism. Wo bhi nahi hua, to kuch aur kar lo. And the worst part is getting into an arts degree. So, especially if you come from a Tambram family, that's effectively, even without wearing the black coat, you'd have been the black sheep. So that would have been the end of the matter. I think your ratings on the matrimonial chart would have been down, and comparisons with cousins on a daily basis would have started, and you'd be the soft target that everybody says. Iske tarah mat banna would be the first comparison. So I think some of those options effectively led me in the direction of engineering. I never assumed that I would actually get into engineering because I wasn't sure what I wanted at all in the first place. I just wanted to be in a profession that allowed me to, how do I say, express myself in some way, as cliched as it sounds. And for an introvert, having chosen law, even I don't know how that happened. So around, I think, the 5th or 6th semester of engineering, by which time the placements were done, my placement was done, I was interested in taking up a master's in aeronautical engineering, rather aerospace, there being a distinction between the two. I was just thinking, is this really what I wanted to do? I just wasn't sure. And most importantly, people assume that I'm politically vocal now. They should have seen me in college. I was extremely vocal. For an engineering campus, I was extremely, extremely vocal. And I used to get into all sorts of trouble, even physical troubles for that particular matter. So hit him, I've faced it, I've seen that, I've been there, I've done that, okay? So as far as I was concerned, I just wanted to make at least some kind of a contribution, even if it's a squirrel's contribution to what I believed in, and what I continue to believe in, what I believe I will continue to believe in for the rest of my life, and I will never compromise on that. So I wasn't sure of what is the route to adopt to contribute to what I believed in terms of the vision that I think this country must have. With all those grandiose visions, like any other engineer, the only two options, in fact, the primary option is civil services. You start thinking of civil services. But with a mouth like this, you can't get into civil services, okay? Because it's not about cracking the exam, but it's about surviving the system. And you'll have to be a yes man for the better part of your life. And for the most part, your tongue will be the color of the shade of somebody else's boot polish. So for all practical purposes, that's how it would be. So I wasn't sure of it. This is not to denigrate that cadre at all. I've seen such brilliant bureaucrats in the course of my profession. My respect for them only goes up when I realize how they survived despite the system, not because of the system. So that's when I started thinking of certain other options. And at that stage is when I had come for a paper presentation at the Industrial Engineering Department of IIT Kharagpur. The Tech Fest was called Optima. So there, the then, I think, director of IIT Kharagpur, Mr. Shishir Dubey, a good and close friend of Sri Murli Manohar Joshi, he was talking about a potential program that could start in 2006. So that was law with an integration, with a specialization in intellectual property rights. So I started thinking about it, I started reading about it. And of course, not that I have a fascination for intellectual property rights, although I have an aptitude for it. Law was ultimately what I wanted to get into. And let's concede, most engineers, at least in India, are suckers for the IIT brand. So I said, IIT Kharagpur mein law, that's interesting. So I said, okay, why not give it a shot? I started thinking more about it, and I realized that perhaps that's the way. All the while I was leading my family down the garden path, because my family thought, law. I said, no, don't say law. It's law in IIT Kharagpur. It helps you. So, because the moment you say law, they assumed, baapre. So in Hyderabad, there is a bridge called Chikatpalli Bridge. Okay. So that bridge is associated with a lot of touts and louts, especially lawyers riding Hercules cycle wearing two unmatched pair of slippers. So they thought, ye karega tu? I said, no, if it is from law from IIT Kharagpur, then think of a different level. Okay. So I sold those dreams, and they didn't realize that ultimately I wanted to get into litigation. I kept stringing them along. But most importantly, to answer the question, I wanted to contribute to the public discourse in some way. And for me, there is no point in having an opinion without actually having the training. So the idea was to understand the system better. And understanding the legal architecture gives you a ringside view of how the system works and who are the dramatis personae. And that's the reason that I chose. And I've always been interested in litigation. Someday I wanted to be in constitutional litigation, but in the first few years, constitutional litigation doesn't pay. So I paid my dues by starting my ropes in the profession as a civil commercial litigator. And over the last 7 years, I did that. First 7 years I did that, and subsequently I decided to switch as much as possible to constitutional law. So the true potential of this profession, the Vishwaroop of this profession, and what it can actually present by way of options, the kind of windows, doors, and avenues and vistas it opens up, is something that I was truly fascinated by. And that's the reason I made the choice. And I can confidently say I didn't do that because I was a failed engineer. I think I was a decent engineer, if not a great engineer.
So, moving on to the next question, which is very related to what the both of you said. This was asked by Manisha and Rudraksh, and this is also directed to the both of you, that if one has to, if one currently goes for a job and then there is this source of income that is coming from the job, then when we decide that we have to work for the society by, let's say, contributing to the public discourse or contributing to the society using public policy, then how do we change our professions? We face the consequence of kicking our source of income. Then how do we go about that?
Okay, so does this space have a source of income, right? And why should we leave behind something else and do this? I think this is probably true when I started 10 years back, when 2009 I came back from the US, where the social sector was still the typical Jholawala kind of image which people had, right? If you are that, then it doesn't work. I think over the last 10 years, I have seen a sea change in this. The whole sector is getting formalized more. There are a lot of opportunities at all levels, right? Right from an activist, probably, I mean, if you're working at the street level, not having much all the way, you have development consulting at the top where there is a lot of scope for growth, career growth in terms of income and all these things. So I think the opportunities are only increasing and there is more acceptance from society for a career like this. There are two pressures typically, right? One is societal family pressure. The second is financial pressure. I think both have reduced over a period of time because today we also see more role models coming up and who are doing things like this. So it's easier when you have a role model say, do you see this guy, I can become like him, right? When I started 2009, one thing worked in my favor was this movie called Three Idiots, which came out, right? So you can always say, Amir Khan dekha na movie mein waisa banna hai type, right? Follow your passion and all these things. I'm just saying that popular culture is appreciating this. There is a dearth of talent in this space, a big talent crunch is there. Because we don't have formally trained people in the development sector or the policy space in this country, the number of people that are needed. So if bright young minds want to come and be a part of this space, there is opportunity. Obviously, it will not pay anything in comparison to what you would get if you graduate from IIT, right? It will always be a fraction of that. That is a choice which we all have to make. That said, I'll just say that usually we look at external constraints and put our excuses on that, saying that this didn't work out for me. I think a lot of it is internal conviction. We have to work internally. So if I ask you what's a fair salary, you will get different numbers from the entire set of students here, right? There is no, everybody has decided, but because we have not even thought of what could be a fair salary for me to survive and do well, and we have not even asked those hard questions to ourselves because we have not kind of contemplated too much about what is the lifestyle I want to live, what do I want to do in future. I think if you develop that clarity, that this is something fair and this is something I think if I get, I'll be happy, I think the opportunities are tremendous and they're only increasing. And this space is genuinely looking for a lot of talent to come in from any place. I mean, engineering or any other stream, there is a growing opportunity and the salaries will catch up very soon. I don't think that's going to be too far away.
Frankly, I don't know how to give a general answer to that question because that depends on the transition to the profession that you wish to make the switch to. So that perhaps is, that varies from profession to profession. I can only speak of my profession. The one thing that perhaps I think is very common to my generation, perhaps even more common to the next generation, is that the basic or the standard default degree has become the engineering degree. So clearly there are too many engineers out there. And I'm not sure that the supply is the same as the demand, or rather the demand is the same as the supply. And two, there is a clear dearth of, as he rightly said, quality options in other sectors. Three, thanks to what has happened since 91, 92, the purchasing power has increased and therefore the ability of people to think beyond the conventional choices has increased, and therefore you're trying to cater to multiple tastes and choices. That opens up quite a few options as far as career options are concerned. So that is one. But most importantly in my own profession, I typically say, and I could be wrong, is that litigation, so law is not a monolithic profession. There are multiple models, but litigation in particular is like acting and politics to a significant extent. So the first few days you sleep on the bench in Bandra, hoping to have a house in Bandra someday. And so during that phase of struggle, you take every possible, I can't use the unparliamentary word, that comes your way, and you put up with everything. And to a significant extent, you're putting your hope in hard work and the unknown. Because the options and the opportunities that come your way, frankly, is a consequence of somebody's belief in you, or somebody takes a liking for you, or that you just happen to be at the right moment at the right time and the right place. So destiny, luck plays a huge role. But what certainly makes a difference, and here I would quote Mr. Ramjit Kulani, is the amount of effort that you put in is significantly proportionate in most circumstances to the opportunities that you create for yourself. So after a point, literally speaking, sky's the limit in the profession, provided you have what it takes to survive the profession, not in terms of acumen or brains, because that's only about 50% of the equation. The rest of the 50% is patience. The rest of the 50% is stamina, mental stamina, to be able to put up what the profession throws at you. And the rigors of the profession are extreme. So a 13-hour working schedule is something that you have to take for granted, assuming that you want to do well in the profession. You just want to be run-of-the-mill lawyer, do what you want. That's a different issue. But you really want to make, or let's say carve a niche for yourself, you're looking at nothing less than a 16 to 17-hour work schedule, and that's not the exception, that's the norm. That's the default standard working model. And weekends in personal life, effectively, you can say goodbye. So you do Sashtang Namaskar to this Devi called Saraswati, and you say, please bless me, give me all that you can. And you keep reading and reading and reading and reading, and that becomes your, effectively, your way of life. You won't realize it where you are in the profession. Others will point out. You'll never know where you are. Others will come and tell you, dude, you're doing okay, don't worry. So what I have realized is nobody else can convince you about the switch. It makes very little sense for anybody to give you a pep talk or a motivational speech. I don't think it works that way at all. You have to be convinced. And if you cannot find the guts or the spine in you to actually make that switch or that jump, there is very little contribution that can come from anybody else. I think there's this famous line from this movie called Chariots of Fire. Man can't put in what God is not. So you can have the talent, there's no doubting it. But what ultimately it calls for is spine. What separates the person who sets up the startup from a person who takes up a salaried profession is less about brains and more about the guts. So that is something that you have to evaluate for yourself.
So moving on to the next question, I'll just like to repeat that the link is live. If anyone wants to post his or her question, they can do so. The next question is asked by Rahul. So, yeah, I'll frame it in my words. So, many of us here are not aware of legal aspects or the policy aspect of the things going around. Many of us don't read newspaper or are not aware of the facts. Facts goes missing when there are a lot of other thing that is floating around. So how do we know the legal issues and policy issues when day in and day out?
Okay, I'll take a quick stab at that and then Sai can speak. I think it is, what should I say, is it an irony that in an age of information sitting at IIT, if you are saying that we don't have the right information sources, it's a tragedy. I mean, I completed my BTech at a time when Google just went public, right? I mean, it was, there's no cell phones at that time, 2004, it is just a very elite thing. If at that time you would say that we don't have the right information sources, I would agree. I think if it is saying today, then it's a tragedy because technology is all pervasive, information is all pervasive. Do we have the mental stamina, as I was saying, right, to be able to discern, identify the sources? Obviously, you can't be reading everything out there. How do we, that intellectual clarity about how do we sift all the signal from the noise, right? And identify the right stuff and read that. I think that is a challenge because we have not trained our mental faculties. We don't have the right exposure to look at the right sources. That is a challenge. I don't think sources are a problem. That being said, if you have, the problem is you get to read everything and then there is this whole concept of fake news. You don't know what is true, what is not for every fact, what is a fact. There are two different facts out there for every story out there. So how do we make sense of the chaotic world? I think that is a bigger problem today. And I think this is where some training in understanding different worldviews, what are the different isms out there, right? This is so many isms being used, and training yourself to look at something and make sense out of it. That is very important. Otherwise, we are in a sea of information and we can't make sense of the whole thing. This we have not done. How many of you read? The options you have, the number of books out there, how many of, forget about newspapers and things, how many of us even have the faculty to be able to read for 5 minutes at a stretch without getting distracted? I think that is being lost. I was also sitting in classrooms in IIT Delhi for some time, did some courses here. If I sit in the back bench, if I could see people in front of me, I saw everything. I mean, people are not able to pay attention even for 10 minutes, even if the faculty is saying something good. We have kind of lost that attention span. We have lost our, the discretion to be able to look at the information sources or the signal and separate it from the noise. I think a lot of training is needed, and this is genuinely where you switch off from information. In fact, if you switch off from the whole sea of information and do some deep study or deep work, that is where you will develop this intellectual clarity. Then even if you see something, you will immediately make sense out of it. I think the problem today is too much information and then no kind of knowledge being distilled out of it. So what I'm trying to say is you need a lot of personal training to be able to. I don't think there's any information loss out there. It is about how do you train yourself to be able to absorb this content. Yeah.
So whoever asked that question, in fact, I'm very happy that the question has actually been asked, because that shows it's a thinking mind, and which is trying to actually make sense of all the chaos around. Two, I also think that my sympathies are entirely with that person, because as Shobit says, I agree partly, but I think the point of departure is slightly different, which is when there is too much of information, that's precisely when the problems start. Which is you really don't know what to make of the sources, the unspoken, unwritten agendas behind those sources. See, assume for a moment that the world is divided into two camps. Let's assume for a moment that's the case, which it is not, but assume that's the case. People who are confidently part of each of those camps can wallow in those echo chambers. I'm from left, you're from right, job done, ho gaya kaam. So you say that the other fellow is fake news, and this mudslinging goes on for eternity, for all time to come, till the cows come home. But people who are sitting on the fence, and those people are actually trying to make sense of what on earth is this? Do I necessarily have to fall within one of these baskets in order for me to take the right decision? And if I do so, am I going to alienate the rest of the audience? That peer pressure, that acceptance, I think that's where a significant problem comes from. So what do? Unfortunately, this problem is only going to increase even more, because there are going to be more portals. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. The question is, how do you deal with that particular piece of information? And if you have a certain mooring, if you have a certain grounding in a certain, let's say, thought process, or in a certain way of looking at things, in a certain worldview, then it's easier for you to filter stuff out. But if that's not the case, every consumer of information today, whether he likes it or not, whether he's trained in it or not, or whether she is trained in it or not, is necessarily a lawyer by training, because you have to apply your judgment, you have to apply your sense of discrimination and try and go beyond that. And which is precisely why I think the newspaper is effectively out of sync with what's happening. What you read in the newspaper for all practical purposes is completely out of sync with what's going on, especially with the news cycle, with the rapidity with which things change. And previously establishments or newspapers or media houses which were believed to be the go-to media houses for, let's say, preparation for civil services or CAT or whatever it may be. Unfortunately, those media houses have turned out to be, let's say, establishments with a certain agenda. I'm actually saying there's no problem with having an agenda. Be clear, sure, no problems at all. But just don't have this facade of neutrality, okay, because that's what creates all the trouble, okay? Clearly identify which section or what you come from, or which camp you come from, or at least say I don't come from that particular camp, and then state your views. This facade of neutrality coupled with pushing the agenda silently, I think that is what creates a lot of trouble, because your mind is fixated on the respect for the certain brand which your father has respected, which your grandfather has respected, whereas the information that you're consuming is practically not worth the paper it is printed on, okay? So that is a struggle which is going to continue for some time. I really don't know what the solution is, because even people who claim to be well-read and well-informed are victims of fake news more often than not, at least once a day. Okay, and WhatsApp University is of course a 24/7 university and free of charge, so that creates more trouble, right? But if let's assume for a moment you decide to say WhatsApp University is stupid, it's dumb and all that, but it's only a medium, it's not even a publication house. It is only an intermediary for all practical purposes for pushing a certain piece of information. Where does that information originate from? What is the source? What is the agenda of that particular source is effectively the question. Okay. 3, I think the problem is anybody who has an agenda is necessarily someone who has to be painted in an evil light. That's become more or less the position today. I don't see what's the point. If you don't have an opinion and you're rootless and you're without information and you don't have an opinion on anything under the sun, why do you wish to cast the same abysmal standards on others? People who have an opinion, let them have an opinion and let them at least justify those opinions. So passing off ignorance as enlightenment and passing off ignorance as a virtue, I don't think should be the name of the game, especially in this day and age of internet and explosion of information. And the other reaction could be that you say, I just can't make sense of this bloody noise, pardon the French. You turn your eyes completely away from it, you shut yourself down. That ostrich mentality, I think, is the worst possible response or reaction to such a situation. Because then you're completely unequipped to deal with issues, and frankly, there is practically no issue today that does not affect any individual at a personal level. If there is a rally outside your home, or if there's a protest outside your home, or in your campus, or wherever it is, clearly each of these national issues have a direct bearing on your life. So you might as well take a position about it, because if you want to shut someone up, you need to know what you're talking about. You have no other option but to deal with this chaos and make sense of it. That's the only simplistic answer that perhaps I can offer.
So the next question, is actually, I would like to club 2 questions. So one is asked by Himanshu and one by Vinay. So the questions are in this form that first is it is directed towards Mr. Shobhit Mathur, that what kind of institutions do you think are needed in today's scenarios? And the second part of the question, that how do we choose that which institution should be a part of? So like if there are multiple institutions that are available in various dimensions in which the society needs, and we want to choose that where we shall be able to work. So how do we choose those, and if there is some need of any other institution? So these are the 2 parts of the questions.
That's a very broad question. I don't know if I'm going to satisfy people who ask the question. See, what I definitely see is there are, if you have come from different state of society, there have definitely been institutions which have lasted for long enough. Typically, they would not fit in the definition of an institution. For example, families as an institution. You have heard this term, family is an institution, right? I think that definitely is an institution because you are a member of it. A lot of what you are today has come from your upbringing. All the choices, if you see the choices which at least I have made, if I look back, I would not be able to connect the dots if I don't trace it back to my childhood or the schooling I have done. So there have been institutions in this country which have traditionally groomed and made you who you are, and they are slowly weakening, and it is our job to strengthen them. So that is one, that is the families and institutions which are born into. Second thing is there have been institutions which have preserved and changed with times in terms of the culture of the country, right? So that at least in the South, there are many traditional spiritual organizations whose role is to, take this to the people, take the culture to the people. That they have done amazingly well, and they are also in some ways weakening today. I think they build the country and the foundation, and we definitely have to acknowledge their role today. Not everything happens from Delhi where we are sitting. Most of the country is run in the social sector and in the spiritual realm, and there are institutions which have kept it alive. So I think that is another institution. But what institutions we need, these are the institutions which should definitely strengthen. Temples have been an institution which have kept this country alive for thousands of years. And what institutions we definitely need is on research, I would say, is the one thing, if I have to say. We have somehow lost that thing in probably the 1,000+ years of slavery we had. That interestingly, this term which was used in the poem when the introduction was happening, this term anvikshiki, the art of critical thinking, the art of critical reasoning, right? Asking the right questions. This was tradition. The art of debate has been lost, right? This thing of churning, the intellectual churning which needs to happen, that has been lost, right? The same agendas which Sai was talking about have also entered academia. Academia is not far away from that. The whole genuine spirit of inquiry and the quest for truth, that is what academia is supposed to do. Generate, search the truth, right? That has been lost. And if the civilization loses that, I think we are in for very bad times. So we definitely need genuine research institutions. You can take a stand as what Sai was saying, but you have to do rigorous research. If something will set us apart from the rest of the world and take us to whatever we want the country to reach, I think that is one institution which definitely has to come up, and we all, should think of research and getting into that as one of our career options. I think that is missing severely in this space.
So, as Mr. Shobhit Mathur said about temples, so this question is directed to Mr. Jesai Deepak, and he is smiling, he knows what is the question. So you have been actively involved in Free Our Temple movement. So can you just enlighten our audience what is actually this movement? What about some aspects of it? Because many of us are unaware of it.
Okay, before you proceed with further questions, I have to give a couple of caveats, very important. One is, if there's a question on Sabarimala, I will not take those questions because one, I think I've spoken on it enough. Two, I'm not a one-trick pony. Three, the matter is coming up before a 9-judge bench on the 13th, and I'm part of arguments before that particular bench. So it would be wrong on my part to comment on it any further. I've said what I wanted to, and the written submissions are available. Anyone who wishes to dissect and rip apart whatever I have said, go ahead, do it. I don't have a problem. Two, on the issue of temples, I think the question before and Shobhit's answer provide for a fantastic sandarbh, which is, I think there are three important institutions in my humble opinion. One is the family. The second is the constituent unit of family, therefore the individual. The larger canvas of which the family is a unit, namely the society, and the dhancha or the mold that keeps the society intact, which is the concept of a state. Okay, these are the institutions that, according to me, which are very, very important. But the state itself derives its identity largely from the civilization that it believes it is a successor of. So it is an inheritor of something. Okay? As part of each of these levels, I believe that the temple as an institution is an extremely important institution. As someone who comes from the south of India, not necessarily South India, I do believe that we, as part of our upbringing, have seen that in action. It may or may not apply to everyone. So there's a decent chance that someone may say, how do you speak for everybody? No, I speak for myself and people who I've lived with. Okay. Two, unfortunately or fortunately, almost every controversy today in the national discourse revolves around the temple in one way or the other. Therefore, it is imperative to understand the nature of this particular institution, be it our own understanding of what is the caste system, be it our own understanding of what is the nature of that particular institution, whether it is a place of worship or a place of prayer. Therefore, what are the rules to be observed? Three, who are the stakeholders to that particular institution who can sit and comment and ask for reform? Okay. If you don't believe in something and you're not party to it, can you necessarily ask for reform without even understanding what that institution is about, without having the necessary training for it? Because it's okay for you to sit and pass this armchair comment that no, all religion is just about social control. I think that's as unlettered and illiterate and ignorant as it can get. Four, I think what is even more important is, today this particular institution has merely become an institution of ornamentation. The role that it played previously was, apart from being a knowledge center, it was also a merchant guild. It also provided livelihoods to so many people. So I think that is what my involvement in this particular so-called movement stems from. I must clarify, my involvement is not in the nature of an activist, because I think activists tend to be attached to their positions to such an extent that when you present them with contrary facts and when you ask them for an open debate, they label you with a certain, let's say, label by calling you a fascist or whatever it is, but beyond that they have nothing else to offer. So I would prefer not to see myself in the mold of an activist. I believe in that particular cause, but I'm approaching it largely from the standpoint of the skill sets that I've acquired over the last 10 years as a lawyer. Which is to say, if the state truly believes in the concept of secularism, shouldn't the state maintain at least an arm's length distance from all places of worship, including in matters of administration? In which case, why does it single out one particular institution for the purposes of control? And why can't it maintain the same degree of respect and distance from Hindu religious institutions as it does from other institutions? This is not an inquiry which targets other institutions of other faiths. It specifically says, at the very least, treat me at par with others and maintain this distance, because the state's entrenchment in temples is single-handedly responsible for the degradation and the devastation of the temple ecosystem and all communities associated with it. Most importantly, the more you read about this particular literature, our shallow, superficial understanding of temples and the communities associated with it, it gets exposed so thoroughly that, let me use this uncomfortable phrase, that this Brahmin domination of temples is such a myth that the more you read it, you'll be surprised. My family has any number of people whose Kuladevatas or family deities are so-called temples which are not controlled by Brahmins, and the priest is not a Brahmin, and a Brahmin cannot enter the sanctum sanctorum, the inner Garbhagriha of the temple. That's the degree of respect that you're expected to observe, abide by, and follow. So the more you read about this institution, the history and the journey of this particular civilization will start appearing in front of your eyes. Nobody can ever say that every institution is perfect and flawless. That is a claim that our religion certainly does not make, or my religion does not make. It actually says that treat everything as fallible, but at least do so with responsibility and approach it with some argument and fact. That's the basic point. So my involvement has been to highlight this particular issue. In fact, while I was aware of it, I was not actively party to it. In 2015, a senior advocate of the Supreme Court, Mr. C.S. Vaidyanathan, who represented Ramlalla in Ayodhya judgment, he was kind enough to ask me to start taking an interest in these matters. So since he gave me the opportunity, I started reading more about it, and the more I read about it, I was astounded that such an issue, which has a bearing on so many people in so many communities, is effectively the subject of elitist discussions and uninformed discussions. So I wanted to contribute to that, and there was already a pending petition in the Supreme Court. Just a few weeks ago, we filed another batch of petitions challenging the HRC legislations of a lot of southern states, basically saying the state's role to facilitate social justice in the temple is perfectly acceptable. Previously, there was a situation, a terrible situation, where a vast section of community was not allowed inside the temple. And therefore, the state's role to ensure that such a situation does not return is 100% justified, and nobody can run away from that. It would be incorrect to run away from that aspect of history. But beyond that, citing that as an excuse, if you are swindling funds of the community and using funds of a religious institution for a secular purpose without the consent of that particular community, you're way out of line as far as any definition, any principle, any canon of secularism is concerned, and that is no more acceptable. That's the principled legal position, constitutional position that we have taken. Let's see what happens.
I think that was a really good answer, because we are also receiving many live questions on the same topic, and I think that covered a lot of overlap with many of those questions. Quickly moving to the next question, which is also been asked during the course, so it is directed towards Mr. Shobhit Mathur. That you talked that it has been asked by the name of Lucifer. So so you said that the art of intellectual thinking has been lost. So how do we recover it?
Okay. How do we recover it? In Sai's answer also you got a hint to that. One is reading, right? I mean, how much of reading can we do? Can we do reading from different, viewpoints, worldviews? Typically, what I've seen is at a very young age, we are taking a very hard stand on or building very strong opinions about things. That particularly comes if you, if you cannot keep two conflicting ideas in your mind and be comfortable with it. How many of us are capable of keeping opposing points of view, letting the churn happen within your own mind, and letting the truth evolve out of that? We take very strong opinions, we hold on to them very strongly, and then we get into camps, and that is where we lose it, right? The truth is somewhere in middle. I mean, there's all dimensions to it. Can we read from various sources? Can we let that intellectual churn happen within us? Can we be comfortable with holding different viewpoints in our mind? That, I think, is real, in that sense, a very strong sadhana if we can do. And that is where the real truth will emanate from. For this, just one is pure practice, if you could do that. One is also being comfortable by saying, I don't know. Today, everybody here, if you take a poll, will have an opinion. I will not have an answer. I don't know will not come very easily. Right? Can we allow that? Can we allow that humility to be there, especially when we have so-called cracked the toughest exam in the country and made it here? It seems dumb to say I don't know about something, right? But that's okay. That's okay. Can we for some time have that opinion that I don't know and I'm still exploring things? And I think some of the things will also come through experience. We are not allowing ourselves to have that experience. How many of us will go actually and meet people, talk to people, take that extra effort, genuinely go and experience it? This is what I think is missing. Just to say that having this ability or the humility, the intellectual humility to say I don't know, and genuinely holding different viewpoints in your mind, and taking that extra effort to go out there and explore it further, and then being okay with being wrong, having the humility to be wrong. I think that arrogance is sometimes creeping up too early in our life, and we miss out on the subtler or the nuances if we just take very simplistic, superficial positions and then blind ourselves to many other things out there. So I think that is very important. I hope all of us here take that effort, and that is genuinely missing in today's discourse. So that extra effort has to go in.
Yeah, moving on to the next question. So this has been asked by Mohit that there are many institutions, and this has been directed towards you, that there are many institutions that you formed from scratch, but students here at IIT are generally confused which course to choose. So how do you get that clarity that what should be the next step? And I think Mr. Sai Deepak can also add in his profession, how does he get the clarity? So
no, I didn't get this. Is like, what course do you choose at IIT?
No. So how do you get the clarity in taking decisions that what should be your next step? So
okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to abstract out something which Sai said, because though we have spoken of specific subject of CA and NRC, rigorous study, right? And this is just reiterating what I've been saying, right? And holding your opinions and then defending them, and being okay to be wrong if somebody contradicts you, not having the kind of, what should I say, the fear that if somebody, you get shamed by taking a step back. These are very important things. Okay, now how do you choose career tracks? How do you choose what do you want to do in life? Very generic question. I think if I say something like, okay, you will have an epiphany and all that, it's false. You figure it out. You should be okay by trying different things, and Steve Jobs' famous, the Stanford speech, right? Connecting the dots. If you look back, you will see somehow the dots have connected. If you say at this particular time, I thought this is the right thing to do and I did it and I found something, it's not that. You need intense internal work. Now how do you do? A lot of this is what is happening is we are looking for external role models, we're looking for what is glamorous, we're looking for answers outside. But a lot of churn also has to happen inside. You are fortunate to be having discussions like this, and you made the right choice of coming and listening to different viewpoints and hoping that something comes out of here which will help you make a career choice. This is all good, but still these are opinions, these are our experiences which we are sharing with you. How do you internalize all these things? How do you internalize different things being told? You will read so many biographies, you will get inspired by people, and then you'll think, I want to do this. I think a lot of churn has to happen within you. Right? And who are you? What do you like to do? What are your strengths? Have we explored ourselves enough? You may have been slogging at the desk and cracking JE, but have you explored other dimensions of yourself? Have you gone in the real world and tested what you have learned? Is it true? So life experiences, lot of reading, lot of introspection, some spiritual practice is definitely needed in this space. If you choose the development space or the policy space I am a part of, it is very tough. It is very tough. Initially, for the first few years, you will be in intense turmoil internally, because you will not know what you have chosen is the right thing to do. There will be a lot of things, external pressures coming at you. How do you stay steadfast on the choices you have made? So that type of clarity only comes with internal work. This is the most understated thing. What we just think, and the typical Western worldview is, you look for superstars and you want to become a superstar. Here you don't become a superstar. It is very, very difficult to become a superstar. You will have to do a lot of intense hard work. Do we have the mental stamina, the physical stamina, right, to be able to last? That will come with internal work, and that will not come without inculcating some amount of spiritual practice in your life. Lot of reading, lot of meeting people and understanding their viewpoints, lot of understanding India itself. You just have opinions probably, right? If you just go, what is true here is not true 100 kilometers from Delhi. Even 50 kilometers from Delhi, it's not true. There's so much of this, and then will you be okay with so much diversity of opinion, so many diversity of, contradictions in this country? Explore, right? Do we get those opportunities to do so? So, but for all this, you need to test yourself and be okay that you will be in an ambiguous state for too long. If you can pass that, once you pass those, I would think once you start in this full time in this space for the first 4 or 5 years, then you are set, because you, by that time, all those contradictions you have resolved mentally in your mind, and then you are set to do it well. But a lot of people will drop out in the first few months itself, not even a few years. So once you have that clarity and you develop it, then it will keep you steady for life. I think it is more about internal journey than external. So don't look at those Western models searching for becoming a superstar. It's not going to happen. Or reading a biography and you will feel you have found it. Now you finally know, I found my calling, right? All this stuff. Probably true for some people, but not true for the bulk of us here. Yeah.
So one thing we can go for as a student is rigorous reading and research. So we are running out of time. This is the last question, and this is addressed to both of you. Anonymously someone asked, I don't know why he or she has not given his name. So the question is regarding emotions. Like we are so emotional about some issues or nation building that we jump to some conclusion or something. So what do you think is the role of emotions in your, what has been the role of emotion in your journey, and how can we direct it towards a larger cause or nation building or some societal cause? Both of you can answer this.
Definitely, I think emotion has a very, very strong role. Most of our life decisions are emotional. We may later on wrap it around some intellectual clarity, but emotion is a very, very strong force. The entire tradition of in India about bhakti has been an emotional. If you are strong emotionally, you can even reach God, is what has been said, right? But I mean, that said, are we? Using emotion as a strong driver is very important. Especially in this space, that will keep you going. At least personally in my life, having some life experiences which moves you very strongly, and that will help you take a decision. And later on, the other things will naturally happen. But emotion will keep you steady on that space. Somehow this being emotional has been seen as a sissy thing, right? Arey, itna emotional ladka hai, right? This is not true. People who have strong emotions genuinely last longer, and they have at least the honesty that I feel, if you can express, and we are not expressing any emotion strong enough, right? If you are angry, as I was saying, be angry, right? You express it completely. If you are sad about something, we are always trying to play this middle path and suppressing ourselves. So has there been an incident in your life which has moved you so strongly? Right, has moved you. For example, if I saw my grandfather's death, right, it should be like, what is the purpose of life? Was such a strong thing for me, right? What is happening here? Are we also going to be that way? Who is going to be around me? What have I achieved and what I have done? So any instance in your life can move you very strongly emotionally and can change your life decisions. So I think having strong emotions is not wrong, and then try to inculcate that. Somehow we have become half human by I mean, making it a inferior kind of an expression of ourselves. So, but the biggest things in this world have happened for people who have expressed themselves emotionally very strongly, right? Especially in the public space. Especially in the public space, people who are driven emotionally very strongly, you will see their influence on people. It's very, very strong. So, but for that, you have to develop yourself to be able to hold it. How long can you be, if you have a particular emotion, how long do you have it? Right? You will very soon, it will burn you and you will do something else. But can you hold it so strong for so long? If something has made you sad, how long can you feel that, right? And that will change the way you live. So I think emotion definitely plays a very strong role, especially in a space which is dealing with people, because nothing moves like emotion. If you give a very intellectually rigorous argument, it will not change the audience as much. I have seen it myself. But if you give it an emotional argument, it changes people. So that is very important. I mean, but that shows how much you can hold it within yourself. That is the sadhana. If you can hold it strong enough, then you can change people, yeah, at a huge scale. Yeah.
If it's okay with you, can I just respond to the previous question as well? I won't take more than 30 seconds on that. Frankly, I think the one thing that everybody should do is just travel this great land, despite its flaws, despite its problems and its challenges. Just travel this once. Just go around this country. So, for the first time over the last few weeks, for the last 2 weeks, in fact 2 weeks, I was traveling deep, deep south. I was so amazed at the quality of people that I met, and especially Delhi being a war zone for all practical purposes. I was astounded at the simplicity, humility, honesty of people. It's not without reason that Tolstoy, despite his racist notions about Indians, effectively said that the gentlest of people are to be found in India, or were to be found in India, or are to be found in some places in India as on date. Don't get me wrong, I love Delhi for a different reason. This is a land of opportunities. I don't wish to be that usual Delhi basher, and I don't wish to sound ungrateful. This city has made me what I am, and so, as someone from the Supreme Court rightly said, so much of blood has spilt in this particular soil that has charged the atmosphere of this place, that anyone who commits himself to this place and works hard is bound to succeed in Delhi. This is the city of opportunities. Whatever you call it, I will defend Delhi to death. It has its problems, but this is a great place. I haven't seen a more cosmopolitan place. Someone with my complexion can practice in Delhi without the fear of being hounded out of that particular court. I can't say how many people from the north of this country can confidently practice in southern courts. I say this bluntly, knowing the profession. So whatever happens, I think it's a great city, and therefore the point I'm trying to make is you have to travel this country and you will realize, because the one part is you're not a unit, or rather you're not an isolated unit, you're never an island. There is a part of this land's culture which is a part of your genetic makeup, whether you like it or not. And that you're bound to realize when you travel this land. So just do that, and the conclusions, surely I can't impose them on you. Whatever conclusions you come to, it's for you to draw. 2, emotion according to me is a weapon. It's like a dragon. And emotion, like temper, is best used when you know exactly how to release it and strategically employ it. You will never be angry, you'll never be scared of the person who always loses his temper. You're going to be shit scared of the fellow who's always calm, and someday he says, you know what, Para sar ke upar chad chuka hai, that's the end of it, I'm taking it. Let's see where this goes. Okay. So there is a popular saying in Tamil, it crudely translates to, if a sadhu loses his temper and he loses his shirt, so to speak, he will set the forest afire. Okay, so I think emotion is what defines India significantly. For an entire month, I was in America for a vacation. I was bored to death. Colorless, soundless, what a dull place. There is nobody honking at each other. There is nobody fighting with each other. I don't understand what is going on in that place. Atrocious. You miss India. Once you get used to this place, you can't live in any other place that that silence is deafening. It's louder than all the people honking on the streets of Delhi. Okay? And I think that is precisely why people from the West gravitate towards India, because they are missing that real pulse, that real vibrance. And when they come to this country, they go crazy. Array, what is this? So many people, what colors are these? What food is this? They are setting themselves afire by eating. Okay, how can you eat this? And they eat. Andhra Bhavan, please go there. Peak time, it's the Westerners eating with their hands, whereas we are asking, Bhaiya, ek chammach de do. Okay. You are asking chammach for what? Rice, and chammach for dosa also. Okay. These guys are eating saying bindas, but you'll pay 5,000 bucks to eat with your hands at ITC Bukhara. That's a different thing. Okay. So you have to really use emotion, but most importantly, what I'm trying to say is, even if it's a journey of self-discovery, I think it'll be an incomplete journey as long as you have not discovered this land. At a time like this, when the turmoil is almost reaching its charam seema, and perhaps in a few more days it will become even worse, all the more reason that you should read about this country. All the more reason that you should know what people are fighting for on both sides of the ideological spectrum. So if you thought that you could arm yourself with degrees, use this country as a launchpad and run away from this place, this problem will visit you in the greenest of pastures in California. It will visit you everywhere, because this issue will not leave. Aapka picha ye to chhodega hi nahi. Okay? Because it's part of your genetic makeup. So my answer to both questions is, I always consider that by default evolution produces, hopefully, more intelligent people with successive generations. That's a rebuttable presumption according to me. So be that as it may, this generation, with the kind of resources at its disposal, and clearly with the right reasons to have a chip on its shoulder because it is certainly more intelligent, must do justice to that particular intelligence by combining emotion with knowledge and a fair amount of groundedness. Just go to Nepal once, after the Maoist takeover and all that and everything that has happened there. They are still so proud of their culture and their origins and their heritage that you wonder what is wrong with us, that we spew venom and spit so much on this country that it's almost as if the default mode is self-loathing, if not otherwise. Okay, so my only request is this: ignore perhaps every sage speak and every piece of wisdom that every guru has to offer. Just travel this country once, whenever you have the opportunity. It'll tell you oodles about what is the pulse of the civilization, the beating heart of the civilization, why has it survived for such a long time, and what is the fabric of the civilization. You may challenge me and say, please define who are part of this particular civilization. You can start an argument with me, that's a different issue. But you'll get the answers yourself once you travel the length and breadth of this country. Just do that favor to yourself. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that answer. Actually, it really ends on a very relevant note, that answer, that travel the country, and which was also done by Swami Vivekananda, on whose account this event was held. So I think now I would like to hand over the stage to Rahul and Vishwajit to take the event forward.
It was a really insightful Q&A session. The questions were answered so tactfully and perfectly that I am sure that we should have much clarity. I am really inspired by the journey of our two guests. To end this memorable evening, I would like to call Professor Parag Singla from the Computer Science Department to felicitate the speakers and give an ending note.
So I guess I'm in a very strange position here. I was listening to the entire discussion. So I'm a computer scientist by profession, by training, right? I'm a professor here, and the two people sitting here have spoken so well. I hope you don't get into believing that technology or science is not really useful, but right? We still need students here, right, who do research and who take up the technology further. On a more serious note, I think it is more about your passion, right? And as much as the country needs whatever they have talked about, they are extremely important, social discourse and right, policy. But I think technology also and science also, right? If you look at the tradition of this country, science was something which was accessible to masses. Technology is something which affects masses, and even today I would say technology is extremely important, right? And whatever we choose has to be based on our interest, our passion, and that is something, the awareness is the key, right? And I think whatever they have said, I'm very glad, is not specific to their own profession, but many of the things that they have talked about, mental strength, emotion, spirituality, sadhana, right? I think which Shobit mentioned and maybe Sai also mentioned. By sadhana, I mean something which you go internally, inwards, introspection. And as much as we play around ideas around the world, what is happening around the world, I would say that it is almost as important to understand also the thoughts which arise in yourself, desires, emotions, and what is this self inside, right? What is it wanting to be? And unless we pay attention to that, we cannot really be effective in the outside world, right? So and in fact, student time is extremely opportune in terms of an opportunity. It's a great opportunity where you can do that internal sadhana. Again, it's not just spirituality, but understanding yourself, right? And utilizing to the best of the capability is also extremely important. I remember when I was in US, as I talked about US, I guess it's not as bad of a place, right? But there is something called, and it's happening in India today, it's called TGIF, Thank God It's Friday. And I feel it's a pity, right? If you have to wake up on a Monday morning waiting for Friday evening, it's really a pity. Right, so we have to choose a profession, and I completely agree with Sai that anything that you do, whether it is technology, law, policy, society, you have to work really, really hard. I would even say that you are probably committing a sin if we can't really exercise our capabilities to the fullest, right? And if work is fun, then whether it is 16 hours or 17 hours or 20 hours, how does it matter, right? I mean, you wake up on a Monday morning or Tuesday morning and you see, oh, there is a great list of things to do, let me do it, right? And that's the way to lead life, right? So let us look for a profession which really gives us this opportunity to look forward to what we really want to do in our lives. Lastly, whenever two things I want to make remark about. One is that humans have immense capability, right? And especially, people coming here, be it or not, right? For whatever reason, we have the great opportunity and also the responsibility, right? Someone who cannot, think about, someone who thinks about others can definitely take care of yourself, right? It is a great responsibility and a position of capability when you can say, I can take care of 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, right? Right next to IIT, 10 minutes, 15 minutes walk, there are people who have, minimal of the opportunities. If you walk down the Shani Mandir outside, you go there and you find people where kids are there sleeping without blankets, maybe, teenage girls, boys, and they don't even have water. And we are sitting here and discussing about all sorts of things, great. But as I said, I think can we think about making a difference to those lives? That is the responsibility that we have. Independent of profession that we choose, does not matter. But let us realize life to the fullest, give it meaning to what we have got here and what we'll get in the future. I remember, there is this Upanishad, Ishavasya Upanishad, and there is this shlok called Ishavasyam idam sarvam yat kincha jagatyan jagat tena tyaktena bhunjita magradasya suddhanam, which what it says is that, this entire creation belongs to the God, right? I'm not saying any personal God. You can think of the society itself or the creation itself, the laws of nature, and it says that the only right that we have is keep to ourselves what is useful or what is needed for me, right? And rest we should give back to the society. In Gandhiji's word, he says the same thing, that there is enough for everyone's need, but there is not enough for one person's greed, right? Further, somewhere else he says, that is called Gandhiji's talisman, that if you feel miserable sometime, then you think about, someone who is dejected, right? Who does not have, who has much less opportunity and much less privilege than yourself. Think about the next action that you want to take, how that action is going to affect that person, and you will see light coming to you, right? And you can extend it further, that if you feel happy, right, there is a very easy way to be miserable. You go in front of a mirror and start asking about yourself. What about me? What about my job? What about my health? And you can try it. Try this formula. Within 15 or 20 minutes, you'll feel extremely miserable. For me, this is the key to success, key to be satisfied, that don't think about yourself. There is, right, the world has given us enough. Think about others and make life meaningful, right? And I think that's the way to live. On that note, I really want to thank the two speakers here. I think they spoke wonderfully, and I hope we will have another opportunity to interact with them at a future platform. So let's thank them again with a big hand. Thank you.
I thank Parag sir for his note. Before ending the session, I would request everyone to stand up for national anthem. जय गाथा जय गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे जय. Thank you everyone.